The manila envelope arrived at the Brennan and Associates law firm on a Tuesday morning, personally addressed to Marcus Holloway. Inside, a single document. The divorce petition he himself had requested 3 weeks prior, now signed by Jessica in impeccable, unconcerned handwriting. No contestation, no financial demands beyond the basics stipulated by law, no drama. Just her signature and a brief note. I wish you happiness, Marcus. You deserve exactly what you've built. He should have felt relief. He should have celebrated with Vanessa, the 28-year-old graphic designer whom he would finally bring out into the open. Instead, something in the cordial tone of that message bothered him all the way home. Driving through the busy streets of Portland under a gray sky that threatened rain. Marcus met Jessica 9 years ago, when she was still a master's student in clinical psychology at Portland State University. He worked as a regional sales manager for a tech company, drove a silver Audi, and wore expensive watches that made his intentions seem solid. Jessica was different from the women he usually dated. Quiet, observant, with an intelligence that fascinated and intimidated him in equal measure. She studied him as if he were one of her clinical cases, but with genuine affection in her brown eyes. The wedding happened 2 years later, in a discreet ceremony at Cannon Beach, with bare feet in the sand and only 20 guests. Marcus remembered thinking that day that Jessica was the best decision he had ever made. She was his anchor, his safe harbor, proof that he could be a better man than his alcoholic father or his divorced brothers. The first betrayal happened 14 months after the wedding. A sales convention in Seattle, too many drinks at the hotel bar, a co-worker whose name he barely remembered the next morning. Marcus returned home carrying guilt like stones in his pockets, but Jessica greeted him with dinner ready and questions about the trip that seemed genuinely interested. She suspected nothing, or at least that's what he believed. The guilt evaporated in a matter of weeks. If it was so easy, if Jessica remained so oblivious, perhaps the slip-up hadn't been that serious after all. Perhaps he deserved these escape valves. Work was stressful, goals were absurd, and Jessica was so immersed in her own patience, in her theses on human behavior and relationship patterns, that she barely noticed when he came home late or invented last-minute engagements. The second was more deliberate, then the third, the fourth. Marcus developed a sophisticated routine. Separate phones, secret email accounts, an apartment rented in the name of an LLC he had created specifically for that purpose. He had become an expert in compartmentalization, keeping his affairs in tightly sealed boxes, away from domestic life with Jessica. At home, they continued to function as a seemingly solid couple. Jessica earned her doctorate and opened a private practice specializing in couples therapy, an irony that was not lost on Marcus. She treated clients struggling with lies and infidelities, while her own husband built elaborate castles of deceit. But Jessica never questioned, never accused, never showed signs of distrust. She made his coffee every morning, asked about his day, even initiated physical contact often enough to maintain appearances. Marcus interpreted her serenity as naivete. Jessica was intelligent in theory, he thought, but emotionally simple. She trusted because she was good, and good people were bad at detecting badness in others. It was almost touching, in a pathetic way. Vanessa entered his life 8 months ago, during a networking event in the Pearl District. She was different from the others, younger, ambitious, with plans to open her own creative studio. She didn't just want casual sex or hidden dinners. She wanted commitment, a future, legitimacy. And Marcus, at 43, looking at Jessica across the dinner table one evening, realized he was bored. Bored by her predictability, by the way she always believed his excuses, by the absence of conflict that made the marriage simultaneously comfortable and suffocating. Asking for a divorce seemed the obvious choice. He expected tears, pleas, maybe even a dramatic scene with objects being thrown. He prepared carefully rehearsed arguments about incompatibility and growing in different directions. But when he finally had the conversation, on a Saturday morning in the kitchen of their Laurelhurst home, Jessica simply placed her teacup on the marble countertop. looked at him with those brown eyes unexpectedly devoid of surprise, and said, "All right, I'll get the papers ready." No questions about other women, no attempts to save the marriage, just quiet, disconcerting acceptance. Now, 3 weeks later, Marcus parked his car in front of Vanessa's apartment in the Northwest, still troubled by Jessica's note. Vanessa greeted him with champagne and a triumphant smile, but he barely managed to match her enthusiasm. During the dinner she prepared, his mind kept returning to that message. You deserve exactly what you've built. What had he built after all? A successful career? Certainly. Freedom to do whatever he wanted. A new relationship with a beautiful woman who admired him. So why did he feel this strange emptiness in his chest? 3 days later, while browsing his Netflix feed, looking for something to watch, Marcus came across a thumbnail that made him freeze. An image of a fragmented male silhouette, with the title in red letters, The Narcissist, a study in betrayal. Documentary, produced by Dr. J. Holloway, released today. His hands started to tremble when he clicked on the trailer. Jessica's voice, calm and professional, narrated the premise of the first episode. For 5 years, I documented the behavior of an individual with severe narcissistic traits in an intimate relationship. With his implicit knowledge, through the residential security cameras he himself helped install, I captured patterns of pathological lying, emotional manipulation, and serial infidelity. This is a study of how zero empathy can coexist with the public image of a successful man. Marcus's phone started to vibrate. Messages came flooding in, his brother, his mother, co-workers, all with variations of the same question. Is that you in Jessica's documentary? He felt the world crumble around him as he realized the devastating truth. Jessica had always known. From day one, from the first lie, she knew everything. And while he believed he was playing chess, she was building a laboratory, turning their marriage into field research, documenting every move for the whole world to see. The woman he considered naive had just turned him into the most public and humiliating case study on male infidelity of the year. And she had done it with his divorce signature still fresh, with a smile, without a single word of confrontation. Marcus finally understood the note. He had built his own ruin, brick by brick, lie by lie, and Jessica had merely documented the process with the clinical precision of someone who always knew exactly what she was doing. The laptop screen illuminated Marcus's face with a bluish glow as he watched the first episode for the 3rd consecutive time. It was 3 a.m, and Vanessa was asleep in the bedroom, oblivious to the silent collapse happening in the living room. Every scene in the documentary was a surgical stab at his carefully constructed self-image. Jessica had edited everything with disturbing mastery. The security camera footage that he himself had installed to protect the house against intruders now showed his own late arrivals, the meticulous care with which he checked his phone before entering, the mechanical hugs he gave Jessica when she greeted him. Her narration dissected each gesture with clinical terminology, transforming intimate moments into symptoms of a personality disorder. Observe the pattern of visual avoidance when confronted with direct questions about whereabouts. Jessica's voice explained as the screen showed Marcus looking away during a dinner. The subject demonstrates an inability to maintain sustained eye contact when fabricating false narratives, a common indicator of cognitive dissonance in individuals with narcissistic traits. Worse than the footage were the screenshots. Jessica had documented his messages with at least 7 different women over the years. Faces and names blurred, but the words remained sharp. Declarations of love that he copied and pasted from one conversation to another, changing only the recipient. Identical promises made to different women. The mechanical repetition of his seductions exposed as a rehearsed and empty script. Marcus paused the video at a particularly devastating scene. It was from 18 months ago, filmed by the kitchen camera. Jessica was preparing his birthday dinner, while Marcus, sitting at the table, exchanged messages with that real estate agent from Seattle. The camera captured Jessica briefly glancing at him, seeing the smile on his face as he typed, and then calmly returning to chop vegetables. No visible reaction. Just that serenity he had always interpreted as ignorance. Jessica's narration at that moment was particularly cutting. This is the turning point in my research where I confirmed the central hypothesis. The subject not only felt an absence of genuine guilt, but derived pleasure from the act of deception. The partner's presence did not inhibit the behavior. In a way, it intensified his gratification. It was the deception itself, not just the external sexual act, that fueled the compulsive pattern. His phone vibrated again. More messages. Marcus swiped through the screen and saw that his company's message group had exploded overnight. Trevor, his regional director, had sent a direct message. "We need to talk tomorrow, first thing." The implication was clear. The company had a moral conduct clause in all executive contracts. Marcus had always found that an archaic formality, something that existed on paper but would never be enforced. Now, transformed into the protagonist of the week's most watched case study on predatory behavior, that clause would likely be resurrected with renewed vigor. He opened Instagram for the first time since the documentary premiered and immediately wished he hadn't. His last post, a photo with Vanessa at an upscale restaurant 3 weeks ago, had accumulated hundreds of new comments. Most were from people he didn't even know, having found his profile through news reports that were already starting to speculate about the real identity of Subject N from Jessica's documentary. "That's literally you in episode 2 at the 23-minute mark. Same jacket, same watch. Men like you are why I can't trust anyone. Your wife is a genius. You're exactly the type of narcissist she describes." Marcus closed the app with trembling hands. The feeling of exposure was physical, visceral, as if his skin had been torn off and every nerve ending was exposed to the cold air. For years, he had meticulously controlled his public image. Now, Jessica had demolished that facade with the precision of a controlled demolition, leaving behind only the rubble of who he truly was. What disturbed him most was not just the public humiliation, but the mirror Jessica had forced in front of him. Watching the documentary, Marcus saw his behavior compiled in sequence, without the rationalizations he used to make internally. He saw the pattern, the mechanical repetition, the absence of evolution or learning. Every new woman was treated with the same script. Every lie to Jessica followed the same basic structure. He was not the sophisticated, complex man he imagined himself to be. He was predictable, algorithmic, a set of conditioned responses executed automatically. "Are you still watching that?" Vanessa's voice startled him. She was at the entrance to the living room, wrapped in the silk robe he had bought her the previous month. Her arms crossed defensively over her chest. Marcus quickly closed the laptop, as if he'd been caught doing something shameful. The irony of that reaction was not lost on him. "I can't stop," he admitted, running his hands through his disheveled hair. "It's like watching a slow-motion car crash." Vanessa approached, but didn't sit next to him on the couch. She kept her distance, leaning against the back of an armchair. "My sister called me today. She watched the entire documentary." Marcus felt his stomach churn. "And? She asked me if I really knew you." Vanessa looked away, gazing out the panoramic window at the lights of Portland twinkling in the early morning. "If I was sure I was making the right choice. Vanessa, you know it's different with me. I love you. I asked for a divorce because I want to be with you legitimately, not because you asked for a divorce because I gave you an ultimatum," she interrupted, her voice firmer than he expected. "Let's not rewrite history now, Marcus, especially after watching an entire documentary about how you rewrite stories." The silence that settled between them was dense, laden with questions neither of them wanted to fully verbalize. Marcus watched Vanessa processing something internally, seeing the same expression Jessica must have worn countless times when she discovered his betrayals, but which he had never witnessed because she had chosen to hide it. "In episode 3, Vanessa finally said, her voice controlled but trembling. "Doctor, Holloway mentions that the subject uses the same seduction tactics with each new partner. The same phrases, the same romantic gestures, the same gifts. She has a theory that narcissists don't personalize affection because they don't see others as unique individuals, only as extensions of their own needs. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. He knew exactly where that conversation was going. "That dinner at Kennard that you said was our special place?" Vanessa continued, her eyes finally meeting his, with an intensity that made him want to look away. "In the documentary, there's a blurred scene of you at the same restaurant with another woman, same corner table. And in episode 2, there are screenshots of you telling someone named C that that restaurant was your special place." "Vanessa, I can explain." "No," she raised her hand, cutting him off. "I don't want explanations. I spent the entire night making a mental list of all the special moments we shared. Each of them now seems potentially recycled. Every romantic word you said to me now echoes with the possibility of having been said to someone else first, and I no longer know what was real and what was a performance." Marcus stood up, trying to approach, but Vanessa took a step back, maintaining the distance between them like a necessary shield. "Everything with you was real," he insisted, hearing the desperation in his own voice. Jessica distorted things. She edited everything to make it seem worse than it was. It's revenge disguised as scientific research. "Is it, though?" Vanessa took her phone from her robe pocket and started scrolling through the screen. "Because I spent the last few hours reading articles about the documentary. Several psychologists are praising her methodology. A Stanford professor called it revolutionary in terms of long-term observational study. The American Psychological Association is considering using it as educational material." She paused, her fingers frozen on the screen, before continuing in a lower voice. "There's an interview she gave today where a journalist asks if she doesn't feel guilty for exposing someone publicly like this. Do you know what she answered?" Marcus shook his head, unable to speak. She said, "For 5 years, I repeatedly asked him to attend therapy with me. I suggested individual counseling. I expressed concern about our marriage in subtle ways, giving him countless opportunities to confess, change, or at least acknowledge there were problems. He always refused, always assured me I was being paranoid, that our marriage was perfect. In the end, documenting became the only way to validate my own sanity, to have proof that I wasn't imagining the pattern I clearly saw. Public exposure is a side effect of making the research accessible, not the primary goal." Marcus felt something shift inside him. A foundation he thought was solid, revealing itself to be built on sand. Memories began to resurface with new clarity. Jessica suggesting couples therapy 3 years ago, and him laughing off the idea, saying that was for marriages in crisis, not for them. Jessica asking if he was happy, if there was anything they needed to talk about, and him always deflecting with kisses and changes of subject. The chances she had offered, disguised in language so gentle that he had completely ignored them. "I need to think," Vanessa finally said, breaking the silence that had formed. "About us, about all of this. You should go home, to your home." "Vanessa, please." "Marcus." She looked at him with a sadness that seemed much older than her 28 years. "The scariest thing about that documentary isn't seeing what you did to your ex-wife. It's realizing that I recognize some of those tactics being used on me, and now I don't know if I'm your partner or just your next case study waiting to happen." She turned and went back to the bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. The click of the lock was discreet but definitive. Marcus stood in the living room, surrounded by the city lights that silently witnessed his world crumbling, brick by brick, exactly as Jessica had predicted it would happen. The meeting with Trevor took place in a glass-walled conference room that made Marcus feel exposed, as if all company employees could witness his humiliation. The regional director was accompanied by Linda Cho, the head of human resources, whose presence confirmed that this would not be an informal chat between colleagues. Trevor wasted no time with preambles. He slid a folder across the polished mahogany table, his face maintaining that neutral expression executives master when they need to fire someone without appearing inhumane. "Marcus, you have been a valuable asset to this company for 12 years. Trevor began, each word sounding rehearsed. But the current situation has created complications that we cannot ignore. Marcus opened the folder and saw his own face printed on a screenshot from a Portland Tribune article. The headline read, "Local tech executive identified as subject of viral documentary on narcissism." Below there were printouts of tweets, Instagram posts, and even a LinkedIn article discussing the ethical implications of his personal conduct in professional environments. "We've received 17 client messages since yesterday," Linda Cho added, her voice professional, but not without a hint of discomfort. "3 of them specifically requested that you no longer lead their accounts. Spring Tech, our second largest client, sent a formal email expressing concern about having a representative whose personal behavior contradicts their company's values of integrity." Marcus felt his hands grow cold. Spring Tech alone accounted for almost 15% of his annual commission. "This is my personal life," he managed to say, hearing the fragility in his own voice. "It has nothing to do with my work." Trevor leaned forward, lacing his fingers on the table. "Normally, I'd agree with you. But this stopped being personal when it became public content with millions of views. Your ex-wife didn't mention your name or our company, but the internet is efficient at connecting the dots. Your LinkedIn profile has your photo. People made the connection. And now that connection is affecting our ability to do business." "So you're firing me because of a divorce?" "We're offering a generous severance package," Linda corrected, pushing another document across the table. 6 months salary, extension of health benefits, and a letter of reference that focuses exclusively on your professional contributions. In return, you sign a non-disclosure agreement and agree not to sue the company. Marcus stared at the documents, the words blurring before his eyes. 12 years of his life, of 6 a.m. meetings and business trips that kept him away from home for weeks at a time, reduced to a severance package and a generic letter of reference. "What if I refuse?" "Then we'll initiate a formal conduct review process based on the morality clause in your contract," Trevor replied without hesitation. "This process is public internally, involves interviews with colleagues and subordinates, and will likely end with the same result, but without the financial package and with much more embarrassment for you." The implied threat was clear. Marcus picked up the pen Linda offered and signed where they indicated, each stroke of ink seemingly sealing his fate a little more. When he finished, Trevor and Linda rose simultaneously, their expressions relieved that it had ended so quickly. "You have until the end of the day to clear your desk," Trevor said, already moving toward the door. "Security will escort you out. Standard protocol." Marcus stood alone in the conference room, watching through the glass walls as co-workers carefully avoided looking his way. He recognized that behavior. It was what happened when someone became socially radioactive, when association with that person carried the risk of reputational contamination. Returning to his desk, he began mechanically emptying the drawers. 12 years fit into 2 cardboard boxes, a few performance awards, photos from corporate events, a mug with the company logo he used every day. A security guard named Derek, with whom Marcus had casually chatted hundreds of times, now stood at a respectful but watchful distance, transforming the mundane task into a ritual of public humiliation. His phone vibrated with a message from his mother. "You need to come over for dinner tonight. We have to talk about this situation." Not even his own family was willing to let it pass silently. Driving back to his home in Laurelhurst, the house that would soon no longer legally be his, Marcus noticed for the first time how different Portland seemed. Or perhaps it was he who was different, seeing the city through the lens of public humiliation. Every person on the street seemed to potentially know his story. Every casual glance seemed laden with judgment. He parked in the driveway and sat in the car for long minutes before he could muster the energy to go inside. The house was silent in a way it had never been when Jessica lived there. He had always believed he appreciated silence. But now he realized that what made the house comfortable was her presence, even when they were in separate rooms. It was knowing someone was there, that the space was shared, that he wasn't fundamentally alone. He found an envelope addressed to him on the kitchen table. He recognized Jessica's handwriting immediately. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a key. Marcus. The letter began without elaborate greetings. This is the key to the storage unit where I've put your things. I've already emptied the house of everything that was yours. The divorce will be finalized in 30 days, and the house will be put up for sale as agreed. I've included the address and unit number below. I hope you find everything arranged to your satisfaction. No malice, no accusation, just clinical efficiency, as if closing a case study that no longer required active observation. Somehow that hurt more than any dramatic confrontation would have. Marcus looked around the kitchen where they had coffee together every morning, where Jessica had prepared that anniversary dinner, while he betrayed her trust just a few feet away. The marble countertops they chose together, the light fixtures Jessica insisted gave the kitchen a cozy feel, the small herb garden on the windowsill she meticulously maintained. Everything was still there, but emptied of meaning, like a movie set after filming had wrapped. His phone rang. It was Vanessa. For a brief moment of irrational hope, Marcus thought maybe she had changed her mind, that perhaps she was calling to say they would get through this together. But when he answered, her voice was carefully controlled, maintaining emotional distance through its formal tone. Marcus, I need you to come get your things from my apartment. Vanessa, can we talk about this in person? I don't think that's a good idea. There was a long pause. I've been thinking all day. I talked to my therapist, and the truth is, I can't trust you now. Everything you told me, every promise you made, everything is tainted by the possibility of being a lie, and I can't build a relationship on that foundation. I never lied to you about my feelings, Marcus insisted, surprised to find he genuinely believed it. What I feel for you is real. Maybe so, Vanessa admitted, and there was a genuine sadness in her voice. But you said the same thing to your wife while you were cheating on her for 5 years. You said it to other women while maintaining parallel relationships. So how can I know? How can you even know what's real when you've spent so much time practicing performances of authenticity? The question hung between them, and Marcus had no answer, because she was right. He had become so skilled at seeming sincere that he had lost the ability to distinguish his own genuine emotions from the performances he staged. It was like an actor who had played the same role for so long that he had forgotten his original personality. I'll leave your things with the doorman, Vanessa continued when it became clear he wouldn't reply. Please don't try to see me or call me. I need space to process all of this. Vanessa, wait. But she had already hung up. Marcus stood holding the phone, looking at the black screen that vaguely reflected his own distorted face. In less than 24 hours, he had lost his job and his relationship. The house he had built with Jessica would be sold. His savings would be divided. Everything that defined his identity, everything he used to measure himself as a successful man, was evaporating. He opened his laptop again, unable to resist the masochistic urge to see what else was being said about him. Jessica's documentary now had articles in major outlets. The New York Times had published an analysis on the ethics of documenting relationships without explicit consent. Psychology Today had an extensive article using the case as an example of narcissistic behavior. There were even discussions on popular podcasts about toxic relationships, and through it all, Jessica remained impeccably professional. In every interview she gave, she kept the focus on the research, on the importance of understanding patterns of manipulative behavior. She never named him. She never showed vengeance or anger. That clinical composure somehow made everything more devastating, as if he were just an interesting study object, not someone she had loved enough to hate. The sun began to set over Portland, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple that Marcus would normally find beautiful. But now, everything seemed filtered through a lens of loss and regret. He had built his life as a series of carefully sealed compartments, keeping his lies organized, his women separate, his public image polished. And Jessica had simply removed the walls between those compartments, forcing him to see the complete landscape of who he had become. The apartment Marcus rented was a compact studio in northeast Portland. far enough from Laurelhurst to avoid accidental encounters with neighbors who knew his story. The walls were white and impersonal, the kind of space that existed purely for functionality, with no pretense of being a home. He slept on an air mattress because his furniture was still in storage, and he didn't have the energy to retrieve it. During the first few days, Marcus barely left his bed. He spent hours scrolling on his phone, obsessively reading every new mention of the documentary. Reddit discussion forums dissected each episode, with users speculating about details of his life. Some timidly defended him, arguing that no one deserved to have their private life exposed that way. But most comments were relentless, turning him into a symbol of everything wrong with privileged middle-aged men. One user wrote something that haunted him for days. The scariest thing is to think about how many Marcuses there are out there, men their wives and girlfriends trust completely, with no idea they're living a lie. This documentary is a gift to women everywhere. It's a manual of red flags. His mother called daily, but Marcus rarely answered. When he finally picked up on the 5th consecutive call, the disappointment in her voice was worse than any anger could have been. "I raised you better than this, Marcus," she said simply. "Your father may have been many bad things, but at least he never lied about who he was." It was a brutal comparison. His entire life, Marcus had defined himself in opposition to his alcoholic father, who had abandoned the family when he was 12. He had built his entire identity on being different from that man, and now his own mother suggested he was worse. On the 7th day since losing his job, Marcus forced himself out of the apartment. He needed groceries, medication for the constant headache that weighed on his skull. The nearest supermarket was a Whole Foods in the Lloyd district, relatively anonymous enough that he hoped to go unnoticed. He was in the cereal aisle when he heard the female voice behind him, hesitant but unmistakable. "Marcus?" He turned and saw Lauren Chen, one of the trainees who worked in the company's marketing department. She was about 25, always friendly in the elevators. The type who genuinely asked how his day was going. "Lauren," he said, trying to sound casual, as his hand squeezed the cereal box with unnecessary force. "How are you doing?" She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable. "I heard about what happened with your job." News travels fast. The company sent out an internal email about leadership transitions in your division. Lauren looked down at her own cart, avoiding prolonged eye contact. Everyone knows the real reason. Marcus waited for her to make an excuse and walk away, as everyone else had been doing. But instead, Lauren took a deep breath and looked him squarely in the eye. "I watched the documentary," she said, and Marcus felt his stomach drop. "And I need to tell you something." "Lauren, you don't have to." "Do you remember the company Christmas party 2 years ago?" She didn't wait for him to answer. "You drank too much and offered a ride home to me and Angela from finance. Angela accepted. I made up an excuse because something about the way you looked at her made me uncomfortable." Marcus searched his memory, finding only fragments of that night. He vaguely remembered Angela, a blonde junior analyst who had worked at the company for less than a year before abruptly quitting. "The following Monday," Lauren continued, her voice lower now, "Angela told me you tried to kiss her in the car. When she refused, you said you were married but that your wife didn't need to know. You said you could help her career." The words hit Marcus like punches to the gut. He didn't remember that. He literally had no memory of that conversation, those actions. But from the way Lauren looked at him, with a mixture of pity and revulsion, he knew it was true. "Angela quit 2 weeks later," Lauren said. "She never filed a formal complaint because she was on a work visa and was afraid of complications. But she made me promise to stay away from you. And I did." Marcus wanted to defend himself, to say he was drunk, that it wasn't really him. But the excuses died in his throat because he realized their futility. Drunk or sober, he had done that. It was part of the pattern Jessica had meticulously documented. "Why are you telling me this now?" he managed to ask. Lauren adjusted her purse strap on her shoulder, looking older than her 25 years at that moment. Because when I saw the documentary, my first reaction was to feel sorry for you. The public humiliation seemed excessive, even cruel. But then I remembered Angela crying in the bathroom, saying she felt stupid for having trusted you. I remembered how many times in the last 2 years I'd heard similar stories about men in positions of power, and I realized that maybe the exposure isn't the problem. Maybe the problem is that men like you have always been able to do these things in the dark. She started to walk away but paused, looking at him one last time. I hope you use this time to really think about who you are, Marcus. Not who you think you are, or who you want to appear to be. Who you really are when no one is watching, or when someone is watching, but you think there won't be consequences. Marcus stood in the cereal aisle for long minutes after Lauren left, other people veering around him with annoyed expressions. His memory of that night was fragmented, but now that Lauren had planted the seed, other memories began to emerge. Not of that specific night, but of similar ones. Inappropriate comments at happy hours, lingering gazes that made women uncomfortably adjust their clothing. Dinner invitations that always came with undertones he convinced himself were innocent. He abandoned the cart in the middle of the aisle and left the store, the cold Portland air hitting his face like a needed shock. He started walking without a specific direction, letting his legs carry him through streets he didn't recognize. He eventually found himself in a small park near the Willamette River. It was early afternoon on a weekday, so the place was almost empty, except for a woman playing frisbee with a golden retriever. Marcus sat on a worn bench and watched the water flow, dark and constant, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding on its banks. His phone vibrated with a notification. Another article, this time from The Atlantic, using Jessica's documentary as a starting point for a broader discussion about consent and power in relationships. The author cited statistics on infidelity, on how many people cheat repeatedly, on the psychological profile of serial cheaters. Marcus recognized himself in every paragraph with painful clarity. For the first time since the documentary premiered, Marcus allowed his denial to begin to crack. It wasn't just about Jessica having distorted things or selectively edited. It wasn't about her having violated his privacy or cruelly sought revenge. It was about the fundamental fact that everything she had documented had really happened. He had really done those things, said those words, lived those lies, and more disturbing. These weren't aberrations or isolated mistakes. They were consistent patterns over years, executed with a regularity that suggested not momentary impulses, but deliberate choices repeated again and again. His phone rang, interrupting the spiral of thoughts. It was a number he didn't recognize, but he answered anyway, grateful for the distraction. Marcus Holloway? A male voice. Professional. Yes. My name is Richard Paulson. I'm a therapist specializing in personality disorders and compulsive behaviors. Your ex-wife gave me your number. She suggested you might benefit from some sessions. Marcus almost laughed at the irony. Jessica asked you to call me. She mentioned that she made several suggestions for therapy during your marriage that you refused. But given the current circumstances, she thought you might be more receptive. Richard paused. There's no obligation, of course. But if you're interested in exploring some of the behavioral patterns that have come to light, I have availability. Marcus should have been furious at Jessica's presumption, at the idea of her still trying to manage his life even after the divorce. But instead, he felt something akin to relief. Because the truth was, he didn't know what to do with himself. He didn't know how to process the weight of what he was seeing when he finally looked at his life without the rationalizations he had always used as shields. How much does it cost? He asked, and even asking the question felt like admitting defeat. Your ex-wife has already covered the first 10 sessions, Richard replied. After that, we can discuss arrangements if you decide to continue. Of course she did, Marcus thought. Even now, even after everything, Jessica was trying to help him. Not out of love, he realized now, but out of that clinical compassion psychologists maintained even for their toughest cases. He was a project for her, a study that wasn't quite finished. "Thursday at 3, he finally said. "I'll be there." When he hung up, the sun was beginning to set over the river, transforming the water into shades of gold and bronze. Marcus remained on the bench, watching the light change, feeling something different from what he had felt in recent days. It wasn't exactly hope, but perhaps it was the first tiny step toward understanding the full dimension of what Jessica had tried to show the world, and himself, about who Marcus Holloway truly was when all the masks finally fell. Richard Paulson's office was in an unassuming red brick building in the Nob Hill neighborhood, far enough from downtown to offer privacy, but close enough to be accessible. Marcus parked 3 blocks away, paranoid about someone seeing him enter a therapist's office. The irony wasn't lost on him. Even after losing everything, he still cared about appearances. The waiting room was small and inviting, with walls in beige tones and a white noise machine that masked conversations coming from the inner office. Marcus was the only one present, so he was surprised when the door opened and Richard Paulson appeared personally to greet him instead of calling him through an impersonal intercom. Richard was in his 50s, with neatly trimmed gray hair and a neutral expression that showed neither judgment nor excessive sympathy. He wore jeans and a casual sweater, which somehow made everything less intimidating than Marcus had expected. "Marcus, thank you for coming," Richard said, extending his hand. His grip was firm but not competitive, professional without being distant. "Come in, please." The office was smaller than Marcus imagined, dominated by 2 comfortable armchairs positioned at an angle to each other, with a small side table between them. There was a bookshelf with psychology books, a few diplomas on the wall, but nothing ostentatious or pretentious. A window offered a view of a tree-lined street, where golden autumn leaves were slowly falling. "Can I offer you some water tea?" Richard asked, as Marcus settled into one of the armchairs. "I'm fine, thank you." Richard nodded and sat in the other armchair, picking up a small notebook but keeping it closed on his lap. "Before we begin, I want to clarify a few things about how I work. I'm not here to judge you or to be an advocate for your ex-wife. What we discuss remains confidential, unless you pose an immediate danger to yourself or others. My goal is to help you understand behavioral patterns and develop tools for genuine change if that is your choice." Marcus nodded, appreciating the straightforward clarity of that introduction. He had expected comforting platitudes or immediate confrontation. Richard's practical neutrality was unexpectedly reassuring. "Jessica mentioned that you watched the documentary," Richard continued. "I imagine that was difficult." "Difficult is an understatement." Marcus looked out the window, watching a woman walk 2 small dogs on the sidewalk. "My entire life crumbled in a week. I lost my job, my relationship, my reputation. People look at me on the street like I'm a predator. How do you feel about that?" The question was simple, but Marcus found he didn't have a clear answer. "Furious initially, with Jessica for exposing me that way, with Netflix for turning my life into entertainment, with all the strangers online who think they know me based on 50 minutes of edited footage. And now?" Marcus hesitated, words catching in his throat. "Now I don't know. Every time I start to feel justifiably outraged, I remember something I did, something Jessica documented, and I realize she didn't invent anything. She didn't fundamentally distort who I was. She just removed the context I used to use to justify my behavior." Richard opened his notebook and made a few brief notes. "Tell me about the first time you cheated on Jessica. Not the details of the act itself, but what you felt afterward." The memory surfaced with uncomfortable clarity. Guilt, a physical weight in my chest. Difficulty looking at her for days. But Jessica didn't notice anything different. Or at least I thought she didn't notice. And eventually the guilt started to feel disproportionate. If it was so terrible, she would have noticed, right? If our marriage was so important, I wouldn't have been able to hide it so easily. You rationalize the absence of immediate consequences as validation for the behavior, Richard observed without judgment in his voice. It's a common pattern. The human brain is extraordinarily skilled at protecting self-image. When we do something that contradicts our perception of ourselves as good people, we either readjust the behavior or readjust the perception. You chose the latter. Marcus felt something tighten in his chest, a mix of recognition and resistance. You're saying I'm a narcissist, like Jessica concludes in the documentary. Labels can be clinically useful, but they can also be limiting, Richard replied carefully. I prefer to focus on specific behaviors and patterns. You've demonstrated characteristics of narcissistic thinking. Difficulty with genuine empathy, a tendency towards manipulation, a need for external validation, moral compartmentalization. But narcissism exists on a spectrum, and behaviors can be modified with conscious effort. Jessica tried to get me to go to therapy years ago. Multiple times. Marcus ran his hands over his face, feeling the stubble he hadn't bothered to trim in days. Why did I refuse? What's your theory? Marcus thought about it, genuinely considering the question, instead of offering the first defensive answer that came to mind. Admitting I needed therapy would mean admitting there was a problem. And if there was a problem, I'd have to look honestly at my behavior. I preferred to believe Jessica was being paranoid or insecure. It was easier to make her the problem than to examine myself. That's a significant insight, Richard said, making more notes. Self-awareness is the necessary first step towards change. But self-awareness alone isn't enough. You can intellectually recognize your patterns and still emotionally repeat them. The question is, do you want to change because you understand your behavior causes real harm, or because you don't like the consequences you're facing now? The question cut through Marcus like a sharp blade. He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again, realizing any quick reply would likely be a lie. Richard didn't rush him, allowing the silence to stretch as Marcus wrestled internally. I don't know, he finally admitted, and the honesty of those two words felt truer than anything he'd said in weeks. I want to believe it's the former. But when I think about Jessica, about the women I hurt, I mostly feel embarrassment at having been caught. As if the problem wasn't my actions, but the fact that they were exposed. That's honest, Richard said, and there was genuine approval in his voice. Many people never admit that, even to themselves. The fact that you recognize the difference between genuine shame and performative shame is important. We work from there. Marcus looked at the therapist with new curiosity. Did Jessica tell you everything about me? About the documentary? She gave me enough context to understand the situation. But I also watched the documentary on my own, I must admit. I'm human, and I was curious. Richard offered a small smile. It was technically brilliant, if that's any consolation. Jessica created a case study that will be used in psychology programs for years. Great. My legacy will be the definitive example of how not to behave in a relationship. Or, Richard gently countered, your legacy could be an example of genuine change, of someone who confronted the worst aspects of himself and did the difficult work of transformation. That narrative also exists, if you choose to write it. Marcus felt tears stinging his eyes for the first time since everything had begun. Not the performative tears he'd produced so many times when he needed to appear vulnerable, but something genuine and frightening in its intensity. He blinked rapidly, trying to keep them at bay. I don't even know where to begin, he said, his voice cracking. How do you undo years of behavior? How do you learn to feel things you've never been able to feel properly? One step at a time, Richard replied, and with hard work. We need to examine your formative experiences, understand where you learned that manipulation was acceptable. Explore your fundamental beliefs about relationships and intimacy. It's going to be uncomfortable. You'll resist frequently because our brains protect these patterns as survival mechanisms. But if you're genuinely committed, change is possible. They spent the rest of the session setting basic goals and discussing expectations. When Marcus finally left the office an hour later, the late afternoon light was turning Portland golden. He sat in his car for long minutes before starting the engine, processing the conversation. For the first time since the documentary premiered, Marcus felt something beyond defensive anger or paralyzing self-pity. It was small and fragile, easily suffocated by doubt, but maybe it was the beginning of something akin to genuine hope. His phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, but curiosity won out. "Marcus, this is Gerald Brennan from the law firm. I need to discuss some developments regarding the divorce proceedings. Please call me when you can." Marcus frowned. The divorce was supposed to be straightforward, uncontested. What could have changed? He dialed the number with slightly trembling hands, mentally bracing himself for more bad news. Gerald answered on the second ring, his voice professional but cautious. "Marcus, thanks for returning my call. I heard from Jessica's lawyer this morning. She's making a different proposal than the original asset division." "Let me guess," Marcus said bitterly. "Now that I'm famous, she wants a bigger percentage?" "Actually, it's the opposite." Gerald paused, and Marcus could hear him flipping through papers. "Jessica is offering to waive any claim to your shared assets beyond the house, which will be sold as originally agreed. She's also setting up a trust fund with a portion of the documentary's profits in your name, specifically earmarked for long-term therapy and rehabilitation expenses." Marcus froze, trying to process what he had just heard. "Why? Why would she do that?" "Her lawyer included a letter she asked me to read to you." Gerald cleared his throat and began. "Marcus, I know you probably hate me right now, and I understand. But you need to know it was never about revenge. It was documentation of the truth, both to validate my own experience and to contribute to scientific understanding. I don't want your financial resources. I want you to have the tools necessary to become a better person. If you can do that, then something positive will have emerged from this terrible situation. The money is there if you choose to use it." The silence that followed was dense and charged. Marcus looked through the windshield at the busy street, people living normal lives, oblivious to the transformative moment happening inside his car. "Marcus," Gerald said eventually, "are you there?" "I am," Marcus managed to say. "I accept the terms, all of them." When he hung up, the tears he'd held back in Richard's office finally fell, silent and genuine, washing away years of carefully constructed self-protection. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus didn't try to stop them. The weeks that followed his first session with Richard Paulson were the hardest of Marcus's life. Not because of the dramatic pain of an acute crisis, but because of the slow, exhaustive work of dismantling layers of self-deception he'd built over decades. Each therapy session was like surgery without anesthesia, exposing nerves he didn't even know existed. Richard wouldn't let him get away with convenient generalizations or performative self-flagellation. When Marcus tried to summarize his behavior with phrases like, "I was an idiot," or "I hurt people," Richard forced him to specify. Which people exactly? How specifically? What impact did those actions have on their lives? The precision was deliberately uncomfortable, making it impossible to maintain the emotional distance Marcus had always used as protection. In a particularly brutal session in the third week, Richard brought a printed list. "With your permission, Jessica provided the first names of the women she documented you being involved with during the marriage. 7 in total, over 5 years. I want us to talk about each one specifically." Marcus looked at the list with growing nausea. Some names he recognized immediately. Others took longer, fragmented memories slowly solidifying into real people with real stories. Amanda, the pharmaceutical rep he met at a conference in San Diego. Claire, the yoga instructor Jessica had recommended to help with his stress. Each woman's name carried a specific weight of shame. "Start with the first," Richard gently instructed. "Amanda, tell me about her not as a conquest or a statistic, but as a person. Who was she?" Marcus forced himself to remember beyond the superficial characteristics he usually catalogued. She had just gotten out of a difficult marriage. She mentioned it the first night. She was vulnerable, looking for validation that she was still desirable. And I used that. I said exactly what she needed to hear. I made promises about seeing each other again that I knew from the start I wouldn't keep. How do you think she felt when you just stopped answering her messages? The question should have been simple, but Marcus found that he genuinely didn't know. For years, he had treated these women like NPCs in a video game, characters who existed only in relation to his needs, and then simply disappeared when they were no longer convenient. Trying to imagine them as complete people with their own emotional lives was an exercise his brain actively resisted. Confused, probably, he said slowly, genuinely trying to put himself in her perspective. Maybe blaming herself, questioning what she did wrong. I told her she was special, that I didn't normally do that. She had no way of knowing I said that to all of them. And if you could talk to Amanda today, what would you say to her? Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the full weight of that question. That I'm sorry, that she didn't do anything wrong, that she deserved someone who saw her as a real person, not as temporary validation for his ego, that the problem was always me. They repeated that exercise for each name on the list, and with each woman, Marcus felt something shift internally. It wasn't dramatic catharsis or sudden revelation. It was more like removing small stones from a backpack he'd carried for so long he'd grown accustomed to the weight. Each stone removed didn't immediately make the journey easier, but it subtly shifted his center of gravity. Outside of therapy, Marcus began to rebuild his life in small, deliberate ways. He took a temporary job at a tech startup in Beaverton, a junior position that paid less than half of what he used to earn. His new boss was 10 years his junior, and clearly unimpressed by his previous credentials. The humiliation of reporting to someone who could have been his subordinate was profound, but Marcus forced himself to see it as necessary penance. His co-workers were mostly young people who didn't follow documentary drama and didn't recognize him. Marcus deliberately maintained professional distance, declining invitations to happy hours or social events. Not because he wanted to isolate himself, but because Richard had helped him understand that he needed to learn to exist without seeking constant validation from others, especially women. You always measured your worth through the desire of others, Richard had explained in a session. Each new conquest was proof that he still had value, was still important. We need to find ways for you to build self-esteem that doesn't depend on external attention or approval. It was surprisingly difficult work. Marcus discovered he didn't really know who he was when he wasn't performing for an audience. His hobbies were all social, designed to impress. His identity was completely intertwined with his professional image, which was now destroyed. Stripped of his carefully constructed masks, there was a frightening void where a genuine personality should have been. Richard suggested starting with basic questions. What do you like to do when you're completely alone? What kind of person do you want to be when no one is looking? If you could rebuild your life from scratch, without the pressure of external expectations, what would it look like? Marcus started small. He bought books not because they were impressive bestsellers to have on a shelf, but because the topics genuinely interested him. He started running in the mornings, not with headphones and tracking apps to share on social media, but in silence, just watching the city wake up. He volunteered at a community kitchen on Saturdays, anonymous work where no one knew his story and he was just another pair of hands peeling potatoes. It was at the community kitchen that Marcus met Daniel, a man in his early 70s who had volunteered there for 15 years. Daniel had a quiet quality that Marcus initially found irritating and then gradually came to admire. He didn't talk much, just worked consistently, treating each task with the same methodical care. "You're new here," Daniel commented casually as they chopped onions side by side on a cold Saturday morning. "What brought you here?" Marcus considered lying, crafting some noble story about altruism. But something about Daniel's non-judgmental presence made him opt for honesty. "I'm trying to learn how to be a better person. I was selfish most of my life. I hurt a lot of people. This is part of trying to understand what it's like to think about someone besides myself." Daniel nodded slowly, showing neither surprise nor judgment. "Most people here have a story. Some are paying their debts to society. Others are running from their own heads. Some just like to help. It doesn't much matter why you start as long as you show up. They worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Daniel added, "My wife left me 20 years ago. I drank, I was unemployed, I was a burden on her and our children. She gave me an ultimatum, and I chose the bottle. I lost everything that mattered." Marcus looked at the older man with new curiosity. Daniel had always seemed so serene, so at peace with himself. It was hard to imagine that turbulent history in his past. "When I finally got sober, 3 years later, I tried to win my family back," Daniel continued, his voice steady as he worked. "But too much time had passed. Too much damage had been done. My wife had moved on. My children didn't trust me. So I started coming here. I found I couldn't undo the past, but I could choose who I would be from that moment on." "Did your children eventually forgive you?" Marcus asked, realizing he was genuinely invested in the answer. "My daughter did, after many years of me consistently showing up, proving the change was real. My son didn't. He still doesn't speak to me." Daniel paused, setting the knife aside for a moment. "And I had to accept that. Forgiveness isn't something you automatically earn by improving. Some bridges you burn so completely that they can't be rebuilt. All you can do is learn from it and ensure you don't burn any more bridges going forward." Those words echoed in Marcus for days. He brought them to his next session with Richard, exploring the uncomfortable concept that perhaps Jessica would never forgive him, that perhaps Vanessa and the other women he had hurt would never see his change or care if they did. That genuine change had to happen without a guarantee of external redemption. "You're starting to understand something fundamental," Richard said, leaning back in his chair. "Authentic change isn't transactional. It's not, if I go to therapy and get better, then people will forgive me and my life will go back to normal. It's, I recognize that I caused harm, and regardless of any external outcome, I have a responsibility not to continue causing that kind of harm." Marcus thought about his mother, who still welcomed him for weekly dinners, but looked at him with a sadness that never quite disappeared. He thought about his younger brother, who had sent a short message after watching the documentary. "I always thought you were better than Dad. Guess we were both wrong." That particular message had cut deep because it touched on the central fear Marcus had carried since childhood. His entire identity had been built in opposition to his neglectful and destructive father. Discovering that he had replicated the same pattern of selfishness, just in a different form, had dismantled the narrative he had used to understand himself. "I'm scared," Marcus admitted to Richard in a session early in the second month of therapy. "Scared that I can't truly change. That this is all just another performance, another mask. How do I know that the regret I feel is genuine and not just another form of manipulation? This time manipulating myself." "The question isn't whether you can be absolutely certain," Richard replied. "It's whether you're willing to do the work even with that uncertainty. Genuine change is proven through consistent action over time, not through declarations or momentary feelings. You'll know you've changed when your actions reflect different values, not just once when you're being watched, but repeatedly when no one is looking." Marcus held on to that thought like an anchor as he navigated through the following weeks. Small choices began to feel like tests. When an attractive woman at the coffee shop smiled at him, and his first instinct was to strike up a conversation, he consciously chose to simply smile back and return to his book. When his new boss made a mistake that Marcus could have exploited to promote himself, he silently corrected it without drawing attention. When Vanessa occasionally surfaced in his thoughts with that familiar ache of loss, he practiced simply wishing her well, without fantasizing about winning her back. They weren't dramatic changes. There was no cathartic moment of complete transformation. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, Marcus began to feel something different when he looked at himself in the mirror. Not pride exactly, because he still carried much of the weight of regret, but perhaps the beginning of something akin to genuine self-respect, built not on external achievements, but on consistent internal choices. It was enough for now. It had to be. 3 months had passed since Marcus started working at the startup in Beaverton, and the methodical routine of his mornings had become something close to comfortable. He woke up at 5:30, ran for 40 minutes through the still dark streets of northeast Portland, showered, made a simple coffee, and headed to work. There were no more emergency calls from important clients, no more last-minute trips to impress executives. Just consistent work, specific tasks completed one after another, building something small but tangible. It was on one of those routine mornings, while checking emails before the rest of the team arrived, that Marcus saw her name in his inbox. Dr. Jessica Holloway. The subject line simply read, "Conversation?" His hands froze over the keyboard. Since the divorce had been finalized 6 weeks ago, they hadn't had direct contact. Everything had gone through lawyers, electronic signatures, and formal documents. Seeing her name there, so casual and direct, triggered a cascade of emotions that Marcus didn't yet know how to fully process. He opened the email with fingers that trembled slightly. "Marcus, I hope this message finds you well. I know I have no right to ask for your time after everything that's happened, but I'd like to talk in person if you're willing. There are some things I need to say that can't be adequately expressed through legal intermediaries. Please let me know if that would be possible. Jessica." Marcus read the email 3 times, looking for hidden meanings or subtle manipulations. But the message was direct in a way that was characteristically Jessica, without emotional embellishments or dramatic appeals. Just a simple request for a conversation. He brought the email to his session with Richard that afternoon, printing it and placing it on the side table between their armchairs, as if it were evidence that needed to be analyzed. "How do you feel about this?" Richard asked, following his usual protocol of reflecting questions back to Marcus, instead of offering ready answers. "Fear, mostly." Marcus looked out the window, watching light rain begin to fall over the streets of Nob Hill. "Fear that seeing her will dismantle all the progress I've made. Fear that I'll immediately fall into old patterns of manipulation or self-deception. But also..." He hesitated, searching for honest words. "Curiosity, and perhaps something akin to hope that she might see I've changed, even minimally." "And what if she doesn't?" Richard asked gently. "What if Jessica isn't interested in validating your progress, but just in having a conversation she needs for her own closure?" The question hit that sensitive spot Marcus was learning to recognize, the place where his need for external approval still resided like a wound not entirely healed. "Then it would be difficult, but I think I could handle it. Because you're right. This shouldn't be about getting validation from her. It should be about having an honest conversation, perhaps offering the apologies I never adequately gave, and then moving forward." Richard made his characteristic notes, then looked at Marcus with an expression that could almost be called pride. "You've grown a lot in the past few weeks, Marcus. 3 months ago, you would have approached this as an opportunity to redeem yourself in her eyes, to manage her perception. Now you're recognizing that the conversation needs to be about her needs, not yours. That's significant progress." Marcus agreed to meet Jessica on a Saturday afternoon at an unassuming coffee shop in Selwood that neither of them had frequented during their marriage. The choice of neutral territory was deliberate, a space without prior memories where they could simply exist as two people having a difficult conversation. He arrived 15 minutes early, ordered a black coffee, and sat at a corner table from which he could see the door. When Jessica walked in exactly on time, Marcus felt something clench in his chest. She looked different in subtle but noticeable ways. Her hair was shorter, cut in a practical bob that framed her face. She wore glasses he'd never seen her wear before, delicate frames that somehow made her look simultaneously older and more approachable. Jessica saw him immediately and walked to the table with that calm composure that had always characterized her. Marcus stood up automatically, then shifted awkwardly, unsure if he should hug her or shake her hand or simply sit down again. Jessica resolved the dilemma with a brief nod and sat in the opposite chair. "Thank you for coming," she said, placing her bag on the floor next to her chair. I know it wasn't easy. How are you? Marcus asked, and surprised himself by realizing he genuinely wanted to know, not as a polite preamble, but as a sincere question. Busy. The documentary has opened many doors professionally. I'm giving lectures, working on a book, consulting for other researchers. Jessica paused, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. But I didn't ask you to come here to talk about my career. Marcus waited, giving her space to continue at her own pace. It was something Richard had taught him, the art of simply being present without filling every silence with words. I did something that perhaps wasn't fair, Jessica finally said, looking directly at him with those brown eyes he had known for 9 years, but only now truly saw. The documentary was valid as research, and I believe it contributed something important to the understanding of toxic relationship patterns. But there was a personal cost to you that perhaps exceeded what was necessary for scientific purposes. Marcus opened his mouth to reply, but Jessica gently raised her hand. Let me finish. I always knew what you were doing. From the first betrayal, I documented everything not just for research, but because I needed external validation that I wasn't imagining things. My sanity depended on having objective proof of what my instincts were telling me. But when I decided to turn that into a public documentary, I crossed a line of revenge disguised as science, even if I wouldn't admit it to myself at the time. You didn't distort anything, Marcus said, his voice firm but gentle. Every single thing you showed was true. I did all those things. I lied all those times. The exposure was humiliating, but it wasn't unfair. Jessica studied him with that clinical intensity he used to find irritating, but now understood as her way of processing emotional information. Richard told me you've been making genuine progress in therapy, that you're honestly working on behavioral change. Richard talks to you about my sessions? Marcus felt a pang of betrayal before realizing the obvious implication. You're still paying for them, so I suppose you're entitled to updates. Actually, I asked him to stop updating me 6 weeks ago, Jessica corrected. I realized that continuing to monitor your progress was just another way to maintain control, to turn you into a subject of study instead of a person trying to grow. What Richard told me was voluntary on his part. When I mentioned I was thinking of getting in touch, Marcus absorbed that, appreciating her honesty even when it was uncomfortable. So why now? Why get in touch? Jessica took a deep breath, and for the first time since she had entered the coffee shop, her composure showed signs of cracking. Because I need to say I'm sorry, and because I need to confess something the documentary doesn't show. Marcus's heart quickened. Confess what? For the last 2 years of our marriage, I was having an affair. The world seemed to tilt slightly under Marcus. Of all the things he expected to hear, that had never even crossed his mind. Jessica, who had meticulously documented his every betrayal, who had built an entire thesis on patterns of male infidelity, had been doing the exact same thing. With whom? He asked, his voice coming out huskier than he intended. My editor, Oliver Chen. It started during the writing of my thesis, when I spent months working intimately with him. Jessica looked down at her hands, the first time Marcus had seen her avoid eye contact. It wasn't constant like your betrayals. It was intermittent, opportunistic, when he came to Portland, or when I traveled to New York. But it happened, repeatedly, while I was documenting your behavior and positioning myself as an innocent victim of your manipulation. Marcus processed that revelation in silence, expecting to feel anger or betrayal. But what emerged was more complex, a realization that relationships were rarely the simple narratives either partner constructed about them. The documentary, he said slowly, was also about you. It wasn't just a study of me, it was a study of how you both behaved in a failing marriage. Yes. Jessica finally met his eyes again. But it was easier to make you the sole villain, cleaner for narrative purposes. And because I genuinely believed my betrayal was different from yours, that it was a justifiable reaction to emotional neglect rather than a primary pattern. But hypocrisy is hypocrisy, regardless of how we rationalize it. They sat in silence for long moments, the murmur of the coffee shop carrying on around them as they processed that new layer of truth. Marcus watched the rain intensify outside, people rushing through the streets with umbrellas and raincoats, each carrying their own complicated stories. "I should be furious with you," Marcus finally said, "for the hypocrisy, for the way you publicly exposed me while hiding your own behavior. But honestly, it just makes me realize how truly messy our marriage was. Neither of us was being honest. We were both using each other for selfish needs while maintaining a facade of normalcy." "I broke up with Oliver 3 months ago," Jessica said softly. "After the documentary premiered, he wanted us to make our relationship public, and I realized I couldn't, because the entire relationship was built on escapism and deception, and removing those elements left nothing substantial." Marcus nodded in understanding. He recognized that pattern now. The way relationships built on compartmentalization and secrecy rarely survive the light of day. "Do you still love him?" "I don't know if I ever loved him, honestly. He represented intellectual validation and emotional connection that I missed in our marriage. But it wasn't genuine love, just need disguised as romance." Jessica paused. "Just as I imagine you didn't truly love the women you had affairs with." "No," Marcus admitted. "They were all performances of intimacy without real substance. I'm starting to realize that I don't know how to truly love someone. Perhaps I never have." Jessica reached across the table, not touching his hand, but placing hers close enough to create a sense of connection. "So we both have work to do. Separately, in our own lives. But perhaps we can do it without carrying hatred for each other." "I don't hate you," Marcus said, realizing the truth of it as he spoke. "I'm grateful, actually. The documentary was devastating, but it forced me to confront things I would never have confronted voluntarily. You gave me a brutal gift, the kind of gift no one wants, but everyone needs." Tears welled in Jessica's eyes, and Marcus saw in that moment that she wasn't the clinical, dispassionate figure she had portrayed herself to be. She was just a woman who had loved someone imperfectly and been loved imperfectly in return, doing the best she could with the imperfect emotional tools they both possessed. They finished their coffees talking about mundane things, her work, his work, Daniel from the community kitchen, the book she was writing. It wasn't reconciliation in the traditional sense. Neither of them wanted to rebuild what they had. But perhaps it was something better. An honest recognition of who they had been to each other, and a conscious choice to release the weight of resentment they both carried. As they parted ways on the sidewalk outside, the rain finally stopping and leaving Portland washed clean and fresh, Jessica briefly hugged him. "Take care, Marcus. Genuinely." "You too, Jessica." He watched her walk down the street toward her car, noticing details he'd never really paid attention to during their marriage. The way she avoided puddles, how she adjusted her bag on her shoulder, the small human gestures that made her real instead of just a reflection of his needs. Marcus walked back to his small apartment as the sun began to emerge through broken clouds, painting Portland in golden hues of late afternoon. There was no dramatic resolution, no miraculous transformation. Just small, consistent steps toward becoming a person who could live with himself. His phone vibrated with a message from Richard reminding him about next week's session. Marcus typed a quick confirmation, then opened a blank document on his laptop. He started to write, not for publication or an external audience, but simply to organize his thoughts. Words flowed about regret and growth, about learning the difference between performative remorse and genuine change, about the long journey of becoming a whole person. Outside, Portland continued its life, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding in its thousands of apartments and homes. And Marcus continued the work of rebuilding himself, brick by brick, conscious choice by conscious choice, knowing that this construction would never truly end, but could, with enough effort, eventually create a solid enough foundation to sustain something akin to a genuine life.